Okay, folks, let's get going, please. I'm Les Huckfield. I'm one of the DD226 tutors, and I'm doing a joint tutorial presentation on Monday, the 22nd of April, with Alberto Zanni. And what I'm trying to do in this short presentation is, if you like, to get you prepared for that tutorial. The reason I'm doing this in this way is that, first of all, we're not going to have too much time during the presentation to go through all the detail that I'd like to discuss. Secondly, as you know, in a tutorial, the main point of view, or the main mechanism for points of view, is for you to put things in the chat. So it's a detailed tutorial that we're going to be giving. Because we won't have enough time to go into everything in sufficient detail. That's why I want to do this advanced presentation. Because it's on YouTube, first of all, it means that you won't have to go through Adobe Connect or any of the OU software to have a look at it. Because you can see it on your phone, because it's on YouTube, it means that you can stop it, you can replay, you can go back and you can do parts of it again. So there's advantages for you in that hopefully you can see it more easily. And again, you can stop it and you can start it again and do that kind of thing. So I hope it's helpful. And I'm just saying that by way of introduction. Let me get straight away, if I can, into screen share. So you'll be able to see the presentation that I'm going to be able to make. Okay, hopefully you can see all of that. Let's get straight away into the opening slide. The main purpose of asking you to do this EMA, the end of module assignment, is not to say you've got to write a briefing or we're asking you to write a briefing, but it really is to show to a local government client how they may do it. In other words, it's a briefing on how to do an evaluation rather than an evaluation itself. And the points to consider, first of all, describe in general terms what evaluations are all about. You need to have some kind of an end goal for doing the evaluation, the central piece of which will be a theory of change. And then you'll be asked to suggest what we call either an impact or an economic evaluation, going through some of the data that might need to be gathered. A couple of pitfalls. Obviously, if you just describe it in generic terms and you can pick that up from the VLE, that won't be very good unless you link it to the actual briefing that you're making. The best answers of all, obviously, are those which integrate the theory, which you can pick up from the VLE, some of the techniques, and the actual briefing for the application that you're going to be suggesting. So assume that this is a fairly bright audience, a fairly learned audience, but also when you go through your presentation, when you go through your briefing, put in the citations, put in the references so that they can check those for themselves. The chuckly bit at the bottom, you would be surprised how many people don't do part B, either because they haven't got enough time or didn't think they have to do it. I know part B is 10 marks, but only 10 marks. But chucking away 10 marks, I would have thought, is quite important, particularly since the EMA can be as much as 40% of your total mark. Okay, question one. And I'm sure you've read it already. You've been hired by a local government of a small island off the UK. Could be the Isle of Wight, could be the Isle of Man. It could be one of the Scottish islands. And you've been asked to advise them on a plan whereby they're going to subsidise a healthy meal box delivery to cook at home with a 50% discount for families with children who choose to opt in. They don't want to do all of that straight away. The government that you're going to do the how to do a briefing for, they want to try just a couple of towns out of 15 before launching the scheme more widely. So the briefing that you're going to be doing about evaluations, general terms, how to do evaluations, what they're all about, give them an end goal of the policy, and the middle of that, and the most important part of that, is going to be the theory of change, which obviously we'll cover. And then you'll need to suggest in the briefing that you're going to be doing about how to do an evaluation is either an impact or an economic evaluation. I know there are process evaluations as well. While it's good to know about those, we don't want you to do a process evaluation. It's got to be, please, either an impact or an economic evaluation. Okay, question 2. This is the other side of the argument. We're asking you, because you work for a public relations agency representing a drinks manufacturer, which it doesn't want to see a sugar tax on the drinks industry. We've given you an Excel file as a background, and you use the evidence from the Excel file and other stuff in the VLE to write either a blog of 300 words or a tweet of 280 characters. I'm not quite sure that Elon Musk will be that encouraged by what you're going to write, but nevertheless, that's the kind of options that you've got, either a blog or a tweet against the sugar tax. And obviously what it's got to do is to try and engage more widely with the public. But please don't put it on Twitter, don't put it on Telegram or TikTok or anything else. Don't post it on the internet at all. It's simply for us to have a look at rather than for you to post on one of the social media platforms. Part B, again, 300 word limit. And what we're really saying to you, as you'll be guided to do in week 28, section 7, is what did you get from DD226? In other words, it's a sort of end of module personal reflection from your point of view. Let's get into more detail. You've seen these slides from me before. If you go to Student Notes Part A and Student Notes Part B, you'll see that what we've done is to break the VLE down into where you get your marks. Because this is a screenshot and not a live screen share, you'll see that there's clarity of writing and suitability for the audience, 10 marks. The role and purpose of evaluation, 10 marks. I don't know how big this is going to be. I hope it's big enough for you to see. But it shows you where the marks are. Now, the interesting thing for me is that apart from showing you the links to the weeks where all the stuff is, what you'll be able to see, quite honestly, from having a look at the breakdown of where the marks are, is not only where you can score the marks, but it's actually, in so many words, telling you what we expect you to write. So it's not just where the marks are, it's a pretty good guide to what we expect you to write. It's the same with question 2, it's the same with part B. Right the way through, if you have a look in Student Notes Part A and Part B, which is either in week 30 or in the assessment section on the menu bar of the DD226 web portal, we've broken down where the marks are, but particularly for question 1, it's a pretty good guide as to what we'd like you to write. Okay, again, some general background before we get into the detail. I have to say to you very, very candidly, there isn't much of an alternative to doing the reading. I'm going to be quite candid with you. We can see as tutors your level of VLE engagement. So every time you have a look at the VLE, we can see what's happening. So that there isn't any substitute for not doing some detailed reading on the VLE. That's an absolute essential. But what I've tried to do here is to say to you, look, there's some big reading weeks. That's not to say that the other weeks aren't important, but these are the big reading weeks. And if you have a look at those particularly, you'll see some of the most important points. Part B, of course, is week 28, section 7. And obviously there's the tutor group forum, which you might like to swap ideas with. There's also the WhatsApp group. But again, if you're a bit puzzled about the sort of overall scheme that I'm sketching, if you go to week 30, go to the assessment, shows you where the marks are. Now, the purple or the mauve bit, call it what you like, it all depends on your cultural background. Right throughout this presentation and right throughout all of my presentations, all of my citations in the text are done in this color, and they link to references at the end of this presentation, and hopefully they will link to references at the end of your briefing as well. It's all in that color. And of course, the reason for doing that is that when you're doing the briefing and you put the citation in, your audience can follow through that citation to the references at the end so that they can see those references for themselves. I've made it easier for you because to save you going to academic books and articles in academic journals, which in some cases is a bit difficult if you don't have access to that kind of library, I've actually put the web links in to my references or the PDF links in. So hopefully it will save you and your audience a lot of time if you want to use those sources. Okay, let's get into straight away where the marks are. 10 marks if you go back to the table that I showed you a couple of slides ago. Clarity of writing and suitability for the audience, 10 marks. First of all, it's a briefing for a client who hasn't done evaluations before. It's showing them how to do a briefing. And if you've forgotten what writing a briefing is all about, if you go back to TMA2, Week 9, Section 6, there's some quite interesting stuff in Week 28 on effective communication. There's a Public Health England briefing on a sugar tax. There's also a study which was done for the UK soft drinks industry, which again, we've given you the link to. There's also a link, by the way, which isn't in the VLE, Scottish Government Directorate for Local Government and Communities, with which I have a fair amount of dealing. They actually did in 2018 a monitoring exercise on some planning changes they'd carried out. Now, okay, strictly speaking, that's a process evaluation that we're not asking you to do, but nevertheless, it gives you a good idea of what an evaluation, how an evaluation might be written up. Again, to summarize, there's adequate material in the big reading weeks, but please make sure you put in the citations and the references so your audience can see for themselves. Again, still talking about clarity of writing and the suitability for the audience. I've said there 23 and 28 give you some good background. Assume that your audience has got not too much knowledge about doing evaluations, so they need to understand that evaluations are part of a structured policy cycle. You need to tell them about the types of evaluations, obviously the theory of change and how the evaluation might be designed. Because we've got a couple of important economic concepts involved, particularly cross-price elasticity, which I'll be getting into, you ought to assume that they won't know too much about that, and yet unless you explain it. And probably the best way of explaining that is by some kind of economics diagram, but we'll get to that a few slides later. Okay, into the next marking element, the role and purpose of evaluation, including appraisal, explain why evaluation is useful, and the main types of evaluation. Week 23, 26, I've given you a summary there. The concept of ex post evaluation is quite important. Ex post means that you're doing it after it's taken place, from the Latin ex post. There's that very important article by Flyberg from 2007 in which he did an evaluation of big infrastructure projects and came to the conclusion that many of them are over budget and some of the reasons that they were over budget. There's a piece on a soda tax which was introduced in Washington, D.C. in the States. There's a piece in week 27, section 7.1 on partial versus general equilibrium, which you'll need to understand to draw the boundaries. There's then that point about cross elasticities. There's also an important Oxford economics study, section 7.3 on sugar drinks and obesity. So all of this is fairly general background stuff, but it gives you some good material with which to introduce your briefing on how to do an evaluation. Okay, again, continuing with the 10 marks which are available for the role and purpose of evaluation. You need to show your audience how the initiative is going to be implemented, what effects it might have, what might be improved, whether it's going to be value for money. It might even be an appraisal of something which is done before, so you can show up the mistakes. It also will hopefully give them the go-ahead for doing the experiment they want to carry out. And then you need to get them to understand the feedback which may have been done from previous appraisals. All of this, of course, is part of our good friend ROMEF, which you came across in TMA2. It's part of the ROMEF diagram. If you go to the left-hand side of the ROMEF diagram, you'll remember from the Treasury Green Book, Monitoring, Evaluation and Feedback. The other slide that I just wanted to show you again, which comes from the Green Book, is the 3 types of evaluation. I'm not going to go into all of that now because I've got to capitalize on that later. But we either want you to do an impact evaluation or an economic evaluation. As I say, I will be dealing with that a bit later. Okay, back to where the marks are. First of all, you need to identify for your audience when you're giving them a briefing on how to do an evaluation, what their goal might be. But the centerpiece of all of that, if you like, is, first of all, the theory of change and what that's based on. But you won't be able to fully understand all of that until you do some of the readings on mainstream feminist and behavioral economics. We don't expect you to repeat that word by word, but just to have a general understanding about where some of this is coming from. Week 23, some interesting stuff on theory of change. The goals, obviously, that you might build into your theory of change, I've suggested some there. You need to explain the theory of change before applying it to the voucher scheme about which you're designing an evaluation. The theory of change design, we'll get into that. The extent to which you're going to start involving the stakeholders is also important. The voucher scheme, if you like, is the opposite of a sugar tax in that you're going to be giving a discount for doing something rather than penalizing people for using something. A very good guide to the theory of change comes from Nesta, which is the National Endowment for Social and Technical Evaluation, a 2013 document. It's a bit old, but nevertheless, it explains in fairly simple terms what a theory of change is all about and how you might be able to do it. Now, because the theory of change is central to what you're going to be recommending, that's actually quite an important document. Okay, again, suitable goal and theory of change. Week 24, I've mentioned the reading 2 in the handbook, mainstream behavioral or feminist perspective economics. I'm not going to go through all of that now because all of that is in the handbook in reading 2, but there are some different approaches, mainstream, behavioral and feminist. I'll spare you all the details here, but at least you ought to know about the background to some of that. Okay, I'm going to jump headlong now into the theory of change. You'll be able to see this in the reading material. So if you have a look at week 27, section 1, that's the outline of what you might do, and that's filling in some of the details. Now, although that's a theory of change based on sugary drinks, and your theory of change obviously is going to be the based on the opposite of that. In other words, you won't be penalizing people, you will be subsidizing people to do things, but nevertheless, you can swap those boxes there for what you're going to do in the subsidized food boxes thing. That's the blank, if you like. That's the blank that I've put on screen for the theory of change. Please, please, please invent your own version of that by all means. If you want to copy that, I don't mind, but the thing that I would, if I may say so, quite strongly advise you against, don't do a hand-drawn diagram. If you're going to do a hand-drawn diagram where, first of all, you can reproduce that from the slide or you can put a box together yourself, you need to do a box like that. The theory of change shows the target group, where the agents of change will operate, the resources you might need, how it's going to be measurable, what are the wider benefits. I think most of those boxes are pretty well self-explanatory. Now, we need to get into something that we've done before previously. If you go back to the briefing that you did in TMA2, and you may remember from TMA2 that we had a situation where the wider social costs or the wider social benefits from building on floodplains were not being fully taken into account. And you might recollect that if we raised a levy on the builders, that was one way of taking into account the social costs of what they were doing. If we gave people more information or subsidized insurance or whatever the remedy was going to be, that might actually have the effect of shifting the demand curve as well. Now, don't forget that because what we're doing in this exercise is to subsidize the demand in effect, what we will be doing is creating a new demand curve. And it's a demand curve whereby obviously it works the same with the demand curve sloping down to the right, but because more is going to be demanded at the same price, that's why we have to show a new demand curve to the left. You can't show it on the same demand curve. You've got to put it all on a new demand curve because the conditions of demand have changed. Now, we do need to know a tiny bit about cross-price elasticities. Alberto will probably go into some of this in his presentation, but cross-price elasticities simply means that if you adjust the price of one good, it may well affect the elasticity of demand and the demand for another good. And in this particular formulation, what we've given you is to show that if you put up the price of sugar, then that might actually, or sugary drinks rather, that might actually mean that more milk is demanded. And if you go halfway down the slide under the formulation, the sugar tax means that a 15% increase in the price of sugar drinks, so the quantity of milk demanded increases by 20%. In other words, the cross-price elasticity is a 20% increase in milk demanded divided by a 15% price increase in sugar. Because that's a positive result, it shows that the cross-price elasticity is positive, so milk is a substitute for sugary drinks. And sparing you all the details, the result of doing that formula and showing how a price change in one good can affect the demand for another good, the outcome of all of that can either be positive or it can be negative. In other words, they complement each other, they're not substitutes for each other, or there may be no change at all because the demand for the one is not related to the other. I'll spare you some of the details, we can talk about that later hopefully, but you need to know about the formula whereby changing the price of one good affects the demand for another good, and we call that cross-price elasticity. That's week 27, section 2. Okay, both in TMA2 and in TMA3, we talked about distributional effects or distributional impacts. In other words, the policy change that we're making has different effects on different income groups. That's quite important, and it's also quite important that you show that you understand some of the theory about all of that. What you're really trying to find out, of course, is how elastic the demand for that kind of food is, or the food that we're presenting, how elastic that demand is. If it's inelastic, it doesn't matter what you do with the voucher scheme, quite honestly, that won't affect impact on purchases very much. If the demand is elastic and there's a switch to more home-cooked meals, then that can have distributional effects as well. And it might actually mean women doing more cooking. If the result of the voucher scheme, the subsidised food, is lower income households consume more healthy foods, then you can view the scheme as progressive. If lower income families benefit more than wealthier households, so again, the voucher scheme is progressive. If you want to rehearse or revise some of the stuff there, have a look at week 20, section 7.4 on equity benefit, which I'm sure you fondly remember from TMA2 about floodbury and flood insurance. And it was also not quite repeated, but there was quite a bit more detail in week 20, TMA3, section 3, and we talked about the progressivity of tax and benefit systems. I've just completed marking a lot of TMA3, so I know that a lot of you did cover some of that in terms of your own understanding, but if I may say so, some inclusion of more of the theoretical stuff about distributional impacts would have been a bit more beneficial. Okay, now we get on to, if you like, almost the kernel or the centerpiece of the briefing. First of all, you need to be careful to identify any shortcomings that could reduce its effectiveness. If there's any aspects of the briefing that you're going to be describing to your audience that are going to enhance its effectiveness, you need to show that. You need to recognize the characteristics of the program, and certainly you need to recognize the benefits of involving what I can only call the stakeholders in the evaluation scheme. In other words, you don't just put it together. You need to be talking to some of the people who are going to be involved in its delivery, and maybe even some of the recipients as well. But again, if you read some of the basics, and I've outlined some of the basics there, it's mainly weeks 23, 25, 26, 27. And again, as I've said, those are the big reading weeks anyway. I won't go into too much here about week 27, section 3.1. There is something what we call an incremental cost effectiveness ratio that shows some benefits don't all happen at once. They happen over a longer period of time as incremental benefits. And there's another good Kenya school example. I'm not expecting you to use that, but just to understand that sometimes if you're doing a new tax policy or a new voucher policy or the kind of thing that we're evaluating, don't always assume that you can see the effects next week or next month. Sometimes it takes a bit longer. Again, talking about the impact or the economic evaluation that we're going to do. And don't forget, as I was saying, although there is also process evaluation, it's either an impact or an economic evaluation that you're going to be able to show people how to do. The impact evaluation, obviously, you need to have a look at the data that you're going to be collecting. What would be the situation before and after the initiative? Control groups and the bias of those that you're going to involve in the samples. Some of this is quite important stuff, which is why I've got a couple of slides on it later. Economic evaluation, again, I suppose some fairly similar issues, the outcomes, what's going to be the benefits, the negative benefits or the non-benefits, and the economic cost, because all of the value of money issues come into this as well. So have a look through the issues which are raised by impact evaluation and economic evaluation. And don't forget that the theory, the centerpiece of what you're trying to recommend, the theory of change, that will also drive the kind of evaluation that you're going to be doing. Okay, now this may sound pretty finicky, but for those of you who haven't done research methods before, but for those of you who haven't done a research project before, this is quite important stuff. Because what you've always got to be very careful of is the features or the discovery or the research or the responses to the research that you're going to be carried out needs to be measured against something else. Now, you can do that if you can possibly arrange it, like every 10th person in the telephone directory or something like that. You can do it on the basis of what we call randomized control trials. In other words, you can go through the potential beneficiaries and you could select perhaps every 50th one or something like that. But unfortunately, and Angus Deaton's got a very good video in Activity 2613 about that, though you would like to do RCTs or randomized control trials for the reasons that he gives, it's not always possible to do that. Now, another method that you can use if you can't do RCT is what we call matched sampling. In other words, you choose your own what we call control group, which won't be experimented upon, and then there's a treatment group. Now, what you've got to be trying to do is to make sure that the control group or the group which isn't being experimented upon, which isn't part of the experiment, has got to match as much as possible what you call the treatment group, or the examined or the researched group. Now, again, this is quite intriguing stuff, and it's quite important stuff, because all the time what you're trying to do is to make sure that what you're looking at can be compared with something similar elsewhere. RCTs is one way of doing that. Matched sampling is doing that. Now, again, because you can't cover everything that you'd like to do in either RCTs or matched sampling, there's another process which is described in week 26, section 5.4, which we call the difference in differences approach. Now, the great thing about difference in differences is that what you're trying to do is to again to compare two groups, that you're trying to look at what might be the observed results or the unobserved characteristics. In other words, you're trying to look at the characteristics of two different groups. Provided the characteristics are constant, you can do that. Now, again, if I may say so, you don't need to know about all of this in intricate detail. What you need to be aware of, particularly in the context of an impact evaluation, is that you need to have another group with which you're going to compare your researched group. It can either be RCTs, match sampling, difference in difference. So if it's an impact evaluation, that's what you ought to be thinking about. If it's an economic evaluation, then you've got to be talking about cost benefit, cost effectiveness, cost utility. And again, we've done some of that previously in previous TMAs. But again, you don't need to go into all the details. You simply need to understand that there are different approaches. I've tried to put a lot of that in a table, So to jog your memory and to sort of summarize it, I put that into a table which I've produced. And that really summarizes RCTs, matching methods, difference in differences. It also talks about regression and instrumental variables, which you needn't know about. As long as you understand, and I'm repeating myself, and I do apologize, what you need to know is that your researched group needs to have another group with which you can compare your group, because that's evaluation. That's what evaluations are all about. How you can decide whether the effects of what you're trying to do is the result of the experiment that you're carrying out, and the best way of comparing that, or the best way of evaluating that, is to try and compare it with another group in the various ways that I've just described. Okay, there's some scales for doing that. And again, there's some different methods of evaluating the scales. Again, dear old Nesta, and I must admit, from my mainstream research, I've never been particularly a big fan of Nesta, because I think a lot of the stuff is a bit basic and a bit theoretical. But if you have a look at the Nesta paper, which I've just referenced, they actually go through the scales by which you can judge things. And the Maryland approach, there's two different approaches. I'm not saying that you ought to use either of them, but simply be aware that there are scales which will give you an indication of the results that you might be looking for. So again, without going into all the detail, if you were to say, for example, that your evaluation, or you are suggesting that the evaluation is either based on a Nesta scale or is based on the Maryland scale, as long as you show in your briefing some understanding of that, you're not going to have time in the word count, quite honestly, for doing all of that, but do show some understanding. Okay, we're now almost getting to the end of what I want to say, which will give me time to get breath, and will probably cause you to think and say, how much longer is this going to go on? Okay, there's three final marking elements. The first one's got 10 marks. The second two have got 5 marks. We're obviously looking for your appropriate use of evidence. And that means, as I've tried to say throughout this presentation, that means the citations of external sources which need to be referenced. We also would like you to show, as we've asked you to show previously, some relevant diagrams, but don't just plonk the diagram into the briefing, into the presentation. You've got to show how it fits into what you're trying to show. And our old favourite at the end, which if I've marked your assignments, you will know I'm pretty keen on using citations in text and a reference list at the end. So using evidence is 10 marks. Integrating diagrams, that's not just plonking diagrams in the briefing, but linking them to the briefing, that's 5 marks. And proper citations and references, that's 5 marks. I've put at the bottom, and I'm quite tough on this, as you will know, I don't think the Guardian and the Telegraph and newspapers are very good sources. You need to use respectable sources, if possible, academic journals, or the kind of stuff which comes at the end of each week at the VLE. If you get to the end of each week of the VLE, you'll see usually a section called references, and that shows you the kind of references that I've got in my last 2 slides, and that's the way that I would like you to try and show your references. If you still don't understand what citations and references are all about, if you go to week 9, section 6, I think that's going back to TMA2 from memory, that shows you how to use what we call cite them right and Harvard referencing. Okay, that's almost at the end. That's almost at the end, except that there's 2 slides here, 2 slides of what I call my bibliography. Now, for those of you who've been to my seminars before, I suppose I'm pretty big on this because I really am quite keen on your showing, first of all, the citations in your text, showing where you got it from, and then the citations in your text need to link with these articles or whatever in the references. Now, what I've done for you, if you have a look at the blue highlighting, what I've done pretty well in all of those cases in which I've been able to do it, I've either given you the direct web links, or in the case of the Magenta book from the Treasury, I've given you the PDF. So with a bit of luck, that will enable you to go straight to those references. If you get in touch with me and say, Les, I can't make them work, my advice to you would be go to the full screen of the presentation. Go to the slideshow full screen version of the presentation, and you'll find that those links work a lot better. That's the second slide doing exactly the same thing. And again, you can see what I've done. I've given you the links, all of which will hopefully work. The Oxford Economics briefing, the Public Health England briefing, the soft drinks industry briefing, the Scottish Government Directory on planning reform, which I referred to you, and the article by Silver, etc., on what happened when they put a tax on sweet drinks in California. So all of those links, if I may say so, if you put them in the full screen version of this presentation, hopefully will work. Now, that's me pretty well at the end of what I want to say. Thank you for being patient. Thank you for hanging on to the end. I hope that you that you will attend the tutorial and look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.